No insulation, no heating systems, no backup plans. High in the Rocky Mountains, the winter wasn't just cold, it was merciless. Temperatures could plunge to 40 below, blizzards could rage for weeks without breaking, and winds screamed across the peaks with the fury of cannon fire. Out here, survival hinged on one thing above all else: shelter. A tent might last a night, a lean-to might hold for two. But in the Rockies, storms didn't pass quickly. They camped on you. They buried you. To live, men needed more than quick cover. They needed structures, built with skill, shaped by instinct, and tested by storms strong enough to kill the careless. These weren't just cabins. They were survival systems. Every beam, every stone, every seam in the wall had a purpose. They had to hold warmth like a furnace, bear snow loads heavy enough to crush a barn, and stand firm when gales tore through the timber. They had to be airtight yet breathable, warm yet safe from smoke, sturdy yet flexible enough to shift with the mountain itself. And all of this had to be achieved with no modern tools, no manufactured insulation, and no backup when things went wrong. Just logs, stone, hides, fire. And the knowledge passed down by generations of men who had faced the mountains and lived to tell of it. For mountain men, there was no margin for error. One poorly built cabin, one chimney set wrong, one roof pitched too flat, and when the storm passed, all that remained was a silent tomb beneath the snow. Between 1820 and 1880, these trappers, traders, and frontiersmen endured some of the most savage winters ever recorded on the continent. Blizzards swallowed whole valleys. Cold froze exposed skin in minutes. Winds ripped roofs from cabins and left men clawing at snow to build makeshift shelters. The only reason any of them survived was because of the knowledge of shelter. Knowledge bought with blood, hardship, and generations of trial and error. This is Echoes Across the Frontier, and tonight we'll uncover the shelter systems that let mountain men outlast the deadliest winters in American history, choosing ground and building strong foundations. The first law of survival wasn't fire. It wasn't food. It was where you built. Samuel Mackenzie, a trapper who had weathered 17 winters in the Rockies, knew this with a certainty etched into his bones. He could feel a storm coming in the ache of an old shoulder wound, long before the sky darkened. He read the land the way a gambler reads a hand of cards. And he knew, pick the wrong spot, and the game was already over. Site selection was everything. Mountain men looked for southern exposure, where the low winter sun could give precious warmth. They avoided valleys where cold air pooled like water in a basin. They stayed clear of avalanche slopes, where tons of snow could thunder down without warning. And they never built on exposed ridges, where the wind howled with the force of a battering ram. Instead, they sought out natural protections, rock outcrops, dense groves of spruce or fir, rolling ground that broke the wind's path. A good site cut heating needs in half. A bad one could tear a roof away in a single night. Drainage was the next law. Snow that melted and seeped beneath a cabin froze into solid ice, heaving walls apart and rotting wood from within. So mountain men cleared organic matter, dug drainage channels, and raised their floors on stone or timber foundations. A dry cabin was a safe cabin. A wet one was a coffin waiting to be sealed. And then came the roof, the shield against death itself. A roof in the Rockies wasn't just cover. It was a structural test. Snow in the high country could pile heavier than stone. A roof had to bear 100 pounds of weight for every square foot. Flat roofs caved in. Overly steep ones risked the wind ripping them free. Only the balance of angle and strength, judged by hard experience, kept a man alive through a storm. Mountain men didn't just build walls, they engineered them. Lodgepole pine and Douglas fir were the favorites, chosen for their strength and resistance to warping. Logs were seasoned when sap was low, cut to consistent size and shaped with hand tools until they locked together like puzzle pieces. Corners were notched in dovetail or saddle joints, strong enough to resist shifting as frost heaved the ground. Foundations were as important as walls. Dry stone bases, fitted without mortar, allowed cabins to settle and breathe without cracking. They lifted living spaces above the snow line, cut off ground moisture, and anchored structures against shifting ice. Snow load wasn't measured in numbers. It was remembered in scars. Men who had seen cabins crushed carried that memory into every beam they set. They calculated by instinct, by trial, by what had stood before and what had failed. And in that knowledge lay survival. Everything was chosen with care. Logs for strength, stones for weight, site for sun and wind. Even the direction of the door mattered, angled to avoid prevailing storms that could blow it off its hinges. Nothing was guesswork. Everything was survival. A man who cut corners didn't last long in the Rockies. The mountain punished weakness. But those who built with patience, who understood how stone, wood, and wind all played their part, could carve out warmth in a land where cold ruled without mercy. To build a cabin in the Rockies was to stake your life on your skill. And for mountain men, every log lifted was a promise that they would see the spring thaw, that they would live to trap another season, that the mountains would not claim them that winter, heat, fireplaces, and keeping warm. Inside a mountain cabin, the walls kept out the wind, but it was fire that kept a man alive. Without fire, even the strongest structure became little more than a coffin of logs buried under snow. Thomas Whitaker knew this better than most. One night, with winds howling at 60 miles an hour and the cold sinking to 35 below, he knelt at the hearth, feeding another split log into the flames. Outside, the storm raged with a force that could strip bark from trees. Inside, his cabin held steady at a livable 68 degrees. That difference, between death in the dark and comfort in the glow, came down to stone, wood, and skill. A fireplace wasn't just for cooking. It was the beating heart of survival. Built from stones hand-picked for strength, it had to endure endless cycles of heat and frost without cracking apart. The design wasn't guesswork. The firebox needed to be deep enough to burn efficiently, narrow enough to keep heat focused, and paired with a chimney that pulled smoke while trapping warmth. A poorly made hearth filled the cabin with choking fumes. A well-built one gave steady heat with every stick of wood. The chimney, more than a vent, was the system's backbone. Too short, and smoke stayed trapped. Too tall, and the draft stole every ounce of warmth. Mountain men adjusted angles, tested airflow, and rebuilt until they found the sweet spot. Stone walls absorbed fire's energy during the burn and released it back through the night. This thermal mass, primitive but effective, meant even as flames died, the shelter stayed warm, a silent reservoir of heat holding back the cold. Heat had to move, not just sit in front of the hearth. Mountain men laid out their cabins so convection could carry warmth into every corner. Sleeping bunks were often raised off the floor and placed where currents pooled naturally. Work areas were kept near the hearthstone where radiant energy lingered longest. Even in crude shelters, airflow was part of survival planning. Fuel was another science. Not all wood burned the same, and mountain men could judge by sight and feel. Hardwoods like oak, scarce in some ranges, gave long-lasting coals. Pine caught fast, throwing up a quick blaze for cold fingers or damp mornings. Aspen burned steady, but left heavy ash that needed clearing. A careful man stacked his woodpile with a mix, tinder and kindling for starting, slow burners for nights, quick burners for emergencies. Preparation always came before the snow. By autumn, cords of wood were stacked high and covered with bark or hides to keep them dry. Enough had to be laid aside for at least a month-long storm, with hidden reserves tucked away for when the mountains turned crueler still. A trapper who cut too little in October might not live to see spring. But fire was only half the battle. Heat had to be kept inside. The gaps between logs were packed with chinking, mixtures of clay, moss, grass, or even animal hair. Done right, it sealed out drafts while letting the cabin breathe just enough. A properly sealed cabin could cut heating needs in half. Done poorly, it meant burning through precious supplies twice as fast while frost crept in anyway. Men learned tricks to stretch warmth further. Stones heated in the flames were placed under bedding or near boots, glowing with warmth long after the fire went dark. Pots and pans, even axes and shovels, doubled as heat sinks, absorbing energy by day and bleeding it back slowly by night. In deep winter, every scrap of warmth was a tool to be managed wisely. Fire management itself was an art. Flames that roared too high burned fuel wastefully, leaving stores dangerously low by midwinter. Fires that smoldered too weakly couldn't push back the cold. The goal was steady coals, heat-controlled and rationed like food. A good firekeeper wasn't reckless. He was measured, watching every log like his life depended on it. 'Cause it did. Of course, fire brought danger along with salvation. Poor ventilation led to suffocation. Blocked chimneys meant deadly carbon monoxide buildup. Vents were cut high into cabins, just enough to let smoke and gases out without bleeding all the heat away. It was a careful balance, refined by experience, and by the hard lessons of men who didn't wake up. Heating was never about comfort. It was about endurance. A warm cabin meant rest, recovery, and strength for another day of work. A cold cabin meant sleepless nights, weak bodies, and slow decline. For mountain men, fire was more than flame. It was a thin, glowing line between life and death, a daily battle fought with stone, wood, and grit against the unrelenting cold of the Rockies, sealing out the storm. The fiercest fire meant nothing if the wind tore through the walls. More mountain men froze in poorly sealed cabins than in open camps, because a shelter that leaked cold was more dangerous than no shelter at all. The Henderson family learned this the hard way. Their first Rocky Mountain winter, the logs of their cabin were poorly fitted. Snow sifted through cracks, ice formed on the inside walls. And no matter how hot the fire roared, the air bit their lungs. They barely survived. 3 years later, after careful lessons and hard rebuilding, their home stood tight and dry, a fortress against blizzards that clawed at the eaves but never crossed the threshold. Weatherproofing was both science and craft. Walls had to lock together, seams sealed tight, and every surface shaped to push back the cold. Mountain men worked with what the land gave them: logs, clay, bark, grass, hides, turning raw material into barriers strong enough to stop a storm in its tracks. Log preparation began long before the build. Men chose trees of even diameter, stripped them clean, and hewed them flat where they'd rest together. Joints were carved by hand, fitting so tight a knife blade could barely slip through. Every connection mattered. A poor fit meant heat lost, wind gained, and weeks of work wasted. A tight fit turned timber into armor. Still, gaps remained. That was where chinking came in. Clay mixed with straw, moss, or fur was pressed deep into seams, layer upon layer, until no draft slipped through. Over time, men repaired and replaced chinking as storms tested it, because one weak seam could undo the whole wall. Done right, it not only blocked wind but flexed with the structure, shifting without breaking as logs settled or swelled. Roofs bore the greatest burden. A flat roof buckled under snow, but a steep pitch shed the weight, sending drifts sliding to the ground. Shingles were split from pine or cedar, overlapped to keep water out. In places short on timber, bark sheets or stretched hides were layered for waterproofing. Every detail mattered. A leak at the roofline could drip all winter, soaking bedding, rotting timbers, and chilling the air no fire could warm. Moisture was the hidden enemy. Condensation froze on walls, pooled beneath floors, and rotted foundations if not managed. Mountain men cut drainage channels, lifted cabins above the ground, and left vents to balance air and heat. Too much ventilation wasted firewood. Too little turned cabins into ice boxes filled with poisonous air. The balance was delicate, learned through mistakes written in frostbite and smoke. Doors and windows were built like shields. Thick slabs of wood barred with hides or layered planks kept out gales. Some men built double doors, creating a crude airlock that stopped heat loss when entering or leaving. Windows, when they had them at all, were tiny, just enough for light, sealed with oiled hides or thin panes of traded glass. Maintenance never ended. Before each winter, seams were checked, roofs patched, hinges tightened. After storms, men inspected for leaks and weak points. Weatherproofing wasn't a one-time job. It was a season-long battle against forces that never quit. A man who built well slept dry, warm, and alive. A man who built poorly found ice climbing his walls and wind whistling at his ear. The difference wasn't luck. It was knowledge, patience, and hours of backbreaking work, sealing a cabin against the mountain's fury. For mountain men, the true enemy wasn't the storm outside. It was the draft that crept inside. And the fight to keep it out was as constant as the wind itself. Emergency protocols and crisis management. Even the strongest cabin could fail. Logs cracked, chimneys collapsed, snow buried doors until there was no way out. In the Rockies, survival demanded more than sturdy walls. It demanded foresight, backup systems ready for when everything went wrong. Martha Caldwell knew this all too well. In the blizzard of 1856, her chimney snapped under ice and snow. The fire died, smoke filled the room, and her husband was miles away. She relied on the lessons he'd drilled into her. Lessons learned from older trappers who had buried friends to the cold. For 6 days, she rationed food, melted snow, and huddled with her children in one corner of the cabin. They were found weak, but alive, when neighbors arrived after the skies cleared. Stories like hers explained why no mountain man trusted his main fire or roof alone. Behind every shelter were emergency measures, the difference between waking to dawn or being found stiff when spring thawed the paths. Emergency heat. When fires failed, warmth came from the body itself. Men layered hides and wool, hung blankets to shrink their living space, and shared bedding to trap heat. Furniture, sleds, even floorboards became firewood when stacked logs ran out. Some concentrated heat by walling off part of the cabin, keeping families in a single warm pocket instead of fighting to heat the whole structure. Repairs in the storm. Snow bent roofs, wind split logs. Waiting for calm meant death. Spare timbers were kept close, hides nailed over cracks, stones stacked to brace walls. Repairs were crude, but they didn't have to be pretty, only strong enough to hold one more night. Backup shelters. Some trappers built a second, smaller hut, or lean-to a short walk away. Rough and cramped, yes, but enough to wait out disaster when the main cabin failed. A miserable night in a smoke-filled hut was better than none at all. Air and ventilation. The hidden killer wasn't always cold. It was smoke and carbon monoxide. Emergency vents were cut or punched open with poles when chimneys clogged. Some kept sharpened stakes nearby for this very task. A breath of freezing air might sting the lungs, but it was better than never waking at all. Food and water. Hunting was impossible in deep storms. Men survived on caches of jerky, beans, or pemmican, stored safe from damp. Snow and ice became water, rationed carefully, boiled when fuel allowed, swallowed cold when it didn't. Families buried root vegetables in straw for insulation, or hid supplies in hollow logs. Every bite was measured. Waste nothing, stretch everything, and hope the storm ended before the last portion was gone. The mind's trial. Storms battered more than bodies. Weeks of wind and darkness wore down thought. Panic wasted fuel. Despair dulled judgment. Veterans fought back with routine, mending gear, telling stories, playing games, praying, anything to keep spirits from sinking. A clear head was a survival tool as sharp as any axe, signals and rescue. When skies cleared, neighbors checked on neighbors. Smoke by day, fire by night, horn blasts or rifle shots carried the call. Survival wasn't about luck or brute strength. It was planning, backups, and the will to fight the storm twice. Once outside, once within. Jeremiah Collins, who lived to see more winters than most, said it plain in 1887. A man dies when he trusts his first fire or his first roof. Live long enough and you learn. It's the backup that keeps you breathing. Lessons in survival. The mountain men who lasted through decades of Rocky Mountain winters understood one truth. A shelter wasn't just walls and a roof. It was life itself. Every choice mattered. The slope chosen, the logs fitted, the fire managed, the cracks sealed. Yet survival was never just about timber or stone. It was the plan behind the plan. Spare wood for repairs, hidden food for the storm, a vent ready to cut when smoke filled the room, and the resolve to keep steady when the blizzard howled for days without end. Still, no man survived alone. When the skies cleared, neighbors checked on neighbors, answering smoke, shots, or horn calls across frozen valleys. Today, I save you. Tomorrow, you save me. That was the law of the high country. Jeremiah Collins put it best. A man's shelter is his life in the mountains. Build it right, and it will keep you warm through the worst storms. Build it wrong, and it becomes your tomb. The mountains never forgave, but the men who learned their lessons endured.